Delilah Marsh stood in the middle of Larkspur Hollow's only saloon at high noon, in front of every man fool enough to still be drinking that early, and told Percival Andrews that she would not marry him if he were the last unmarried man in Wyoming territory. Before we begin, hit subscribe and stay with me until the very end. And drop the name of the city you're watching from in the comments so I can see just how far this story has traveled tonight. You don't mean that, Percival said, red-faced, his hat crushed in both hands. Every girl says things like that. I'm not every girl, Del said. And I did mean it. I've meant it 4 times now if you're counting. Which apparently the whole town is. Laughter rippled through the saloon, not with her, at her. The particular laughter of men who had watched this exact scene play out before, with different names in Percival's place, and found it more entertaining each time. Del Marsh turned and walked out through the swinging doors into the white glare of the street, and did not let herself run, though everything in her wanted to. She was 26 years old, and she had been the subject of Larkspur Hollow's favorite joke for almost 8 of those years. The wild rancher's daughter. Too sharp-tongued, too capable, too unwilling to be managed. She ran 2,000 head of cattle better than her father had in his healthy years, and every man in the county seemed to consider that less an accomplishment than a problem requiring correction. Horace Tillman watched her go from his table near the window, and did not laugh with the others. He was a narrow man, precise in his dress, with the particular stillness of someone who had learned that patience made more money than temper. He had been waiting 11 months for Angus Marsh's loan payments to fall behind, and they were about to. He knew it the way a man knows weather. What he needed was a distraction big enough that nobody in that family had the attention left to fight him properly when the foreclosure notice came. A wedding, he thought, watching Del's stiff shoulders disappear down the street. A wedding would do nicely. Something that occupied the daughter entirely and left the father exposed. He turned to the table of ranch hands and idle men beside him, and he smiled the smile of a man who had just found the shape of his own good luck. $300, Tillman said, loud enough to carry, to any man who gets Delilah Marsh to accept a proposal before the first snow. The saloon went quiet, and then it did not. Weston Cade rode into Larkspur Hollow 4 days later, with $11 to his name, a string of 2 horses he hadn't eaten in 3 weeks because he needed them more than he needed food, and a debt in Cheyenne that followed him like a second shadow. His partner Tom had died breaking a green stallion 18 months back, and Wes had been the one to carry him to the doctor, and Wes had been the one whose name went on the hospital bill when Tom didn't have people to pay it, and Wes had been paying it in slow, grinding installments ever since, because that was the kind of thing a man did for a partner who wasn't there anymore to argue about it. He was good with horses. He was tired in the particular way of a man who had been good at something for a long time, without it ever adding up to anything he could keep. He heard about the bet before he'd even gotten his own horse stabled, from a loose-lipped stockboy at the livery, who seemed to think it was the funniest thing that had happened in Larkspur Hollow in a decade. $300, the boy said, just for getting Del Marsh to say yes. Half the town's tried already and got their teeth kicked in for it, figuratively speaking. She don't scare easy. Wes said nothing to that. He had $11 and a debt that would take him another year to clear at his current pace, and he was tired in his bones, and $300 was the kind of number that made a desperate man's mind go quiet and calculating in a way he wasn't proud of. He told himself he'd think about it. He told himself that for exactly as long as it took him to walk from the livery to the bank, where Horace Tillman sat behind a desk too fine for a town this small, and laid the terms out plain. I don't propose marriage to women I've never met, Wes said. You don't have to propose today, Tillman said. You have to be in her life by first snow. Marsh Ranch needs a hand who knows horses. I happen to know their short one. He slid a folded bill across the desk. An advance. A taste. Take the job. Do it honestly. Everything after that is between you and her. Wes looked at the money for a long moment. He thought about Tom's hospital bill, still not half paid. He thought about $11 and 2 thin horses. He thought, God forgive me, that a job was just a job, and that whatever happened after he took it was still his own choice to make. He took the money. He hated himself a little for it, in a way he couldn't yet name clearly, and he rode out to Marsh Ranch the next morning, telling himself it was only ever going to be honest work. Del Marsh was standing in the corral when he arrived, working a spooked bay gelding on a lunge line, with a patience that surprised him before he'd even seen her face clearly. She had her hair pulled back hard under a battered hat, sleeves rolled to the elbow, and she did not look up when he swung down off his horse, because the gelding needed her full attention more than any stranger did. "You're late," she said, still watching the horse. "Didn't know I had a time to be late for. My father hired you at 9. It's 10:15. Your father," Wes said carefully, "didn't mention a time." Del finally looked at him then, a quick assessing glance that took in the horses, the worn tack, the way he stood, and dismissed most of it as unimportant before she'd even finished the sentence in her head. "You're the horsebreaker." Weston Cade. "Well, Weston Cade, that gelding's been ruined by somebody's rough hands, and I've got 6 more like him, and I don't have patience for a man who thinks charm makes up for punctuality." She nodded toward the barn. "Tack room's through there. If you're half as good as you're being paid like you think you are, you'll have him gentled by supper." She turned back to the horse before he could answer, and Wes stood there a moment in the dust of the corral, faintly stung. Faintly something else he didn't examine too closely, and thought that Horace Tillman's $300 had just gotten considerably more complicated than he'd planned for. He had the gelding gentled by supper. He didn't say a word about it. Del noticed anyway. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that Wes hadn't expected, and found himself, somewhat against his will, coming to want. He worked the horses at dawn. Del worked the ledgers and the herd, and her father's failing health, with a grim competence that reminded him, uncomfortably, of himself at his most desperate. Angus Marsh was a proud man laid low by a weak heart, and he spent most days in a chair on the porch giving instructions nobody followed, because everyone, including Angus, knew Del's instructions were better. "He hates it," Sadie Marsh told Wes one evening, watching her father from the porch steps. She was 17, quick with a laugh, the softer counterpart to her older sister's edges, watching her run things, not because she's bad at it, because she's better than he ever was, and he doesn't know what that makes him. "Must be hard on her too," Wes said. Sadie looked at him with an expression older than her years, harder than you'd think. Everybody in that town's decided she's some kind of puzzle needs solving. Fella after fella coming round, trying to be the one who finally gets her to say yes to something. She's tired, Mr. Cade. She's been tired a long while. Wes felt something in his chest go tight and unpleasant at that, some early cousin of shame that hadn't yet found its full shape, and he did not sleep well that night. He earned Del's grudging respect the way he'd earned everything worth having in his life, through work rather than words. He didn't flatter her. He didn't comment on her looks or her sharpness the way half the county apparently did. When she corrected his method with a horse, he listened and adjusted instead of arguing his pride. When a storm rolled through in the second week and half the herd scattered toward the ridge, he rode out into the rain beside her without being asked, and they brought the cattle back together, soaked through, and silent. And something between them shifted into a different register entirely. "You didn't have to do that," Del said afterward, toweling rain from her hair in the barn doorway, her voice rougher than usual with exhaustion. "Wasn't a question of having to," Wes said. "Your herd, your storm, my hands." Seemed simple enough. She looked at him a long moment, something considering in her face that hadn't been there before. Most men who work for my father find reasons to be somewhere else when the weather turns bad. Easier to let the boss's daughter handle it and take the wages regardless. I'm not most men. No, Dell said slowly, like she was testing the truth of it. I'm starting to think you're not. He told her about Tom that night, sitting on overturned crates in the barn while the rain finished itself out overhead. The whole story, the green stallion and the hospital bill, and the debt that still followed him. He hadn't told anyone the whole of it before. Not like that. Not plain and unguarded, the way Dell listened, without performing sympathy, just receiving the truth of it and letting it sit between them with the weight it deserved. That's why you took this job, Dell said. The debt. Wes felt the lie of omission sitting heavy in his mouth, the bet unspoken beneath the truth he'd just given her. Partly, he said, and hated that it was the truest thing he could manage without breaking something he wasn't ready to break yet. Dell nodded, satisfied with partly, not knowing there was a whole different partly underneath it that would have changed everything if she'd known. By the fourth week, Weston Cade had stopped thinking about the $300 almost entirely, and when he did think of it, it arrived in his chest like a stone dropped into still water, ugly and unwelcome, a reminder of the worst bargain he'd ever made. He found Dell early one morning, sitting alone on the fence rail, overlooking the east pasture, watching the sun come up over land that would very likely not be hers much longer if her father's debts caught up the way Wes suspected they would. She didn't hear him approach at first, and he had a moment to watch her face unguarded, tired and fierce and lovely, in a way that had nothing to do with what anyone in town said about her, and everything to do with who she actually was. You're up early, he said. Couldn't sleep. Papa's cough is worse. And the bank sent another letter. She didn't look at him. Tillman wants a meeting next week. I know what that means. Wes's stomach turned cold and sharp at the name. Tillman, he said carefully. He's been circling this ranch for 2 years, waiting for Papa to slip. Dell's jaw was tight. I've kept us current every quarter through sheer stubbornness, but Papa's health is failing faster than the herd's recovering, and I think Tillman knows it. Men like that always know exactly when to move. Wes sat on the fence beside her, close enough to feel the cold morning air between them narrow into something warmer, and he thought about the folded bill Tillman had slid across his desk, and he thought about how that same man was now circling this woman's home like a buzzard reading weather, and something in him went very still and very resolved. I want to ride into town with you next week, he said. This isn't your fight, Wes. Maybe not, he said. But I've got a bad feeling about Horace Tillman that goes beyond ordinary banking, and I'd rather be standing beside you when you find out I'm right than reading about it after the fact. Dell looked at him then, something soft moving behind her usual guardedness, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all, and the sun kept climbing over land that felt, however briefly, entirely safe. All right, she said finally. Beside me then, Wes felt the weight of the bet settle over that small agreement like a shadow, and understood with sudden and complete clarity that he could not let this go on 1 day longer without her knowing the truth of how he'd come to be standing there in the first place. He resolved to tell her that night. He rode back to town instead to settle it with Tillman first, so that whatever he confessed to Dell, he could tell her honestly that it was already finished. That decision, made with the best of intentions, was the mistake that nearly cost him everything. Horace Tillman's office smelled of good tobacco and better paper, and he did not look up right away when Wes came through the door, letting the silence stretch just long enough to establish whose office it was. Mr. Cade, Tillman said finally, setting down his pen. Come to collect early? First snow's still weeks off. Come to tell you I'm not collecting at all, Wes said. I want out of the bet. Something flickered behind Tillman's eyes, quick and cold. That's not how an arrangement works. You took the advance. I'll pay it back. Every cent. On whatever terms you like." "I don't want it back," Tillman said. "I want the ranch, Mr. Cade, and a distracted, married-off Marsh daughter is a considerably softer target than a sharp one running the books full-time. You've been useful to me exactly as you were. This sudden attack of conscience is inconvenient." Wes felt something cold settle in his stomach. This was never about the money to you at all. The money was never the point, Tillman agreed pleasantly. The point was distraction. And you've provided it admirably, whatever your intentions. He picked his pen back up, dismissing Wes with the gesture. "Walk away if you like. But I'll be paying Miss Marsh a visit of my own before the week is out, and I think she'll find the story considerably more interesting told in my voice than yours." Wes stood there a moment, the full shape of the trap closing around him with sickening clarity. He had thought refusing the bet was the noble act, the clean break, and instead he had simply handed Tillman a weapon and confirmed exactly how much it would hurt. He rode back to Marsh Ranch that night at a hard gallop, intending to tell Dell everything himself before Tillman could twist it into something crueler. He was too late by 6 hours. Tillman had ridden out that same afternoon, while Wes was still in town settling accounts, and had told Dell Marsh everything, in precisely the tone calculated to do the most damage. The bet. The $300. The advance already collected. He left out entirely his own role in engineering it, and framed it instead as the plain, ugly truth the horsebreaker she'd come to trust had been paid to make her fall for him. Wes found her in the barn, alone, mucking a stall with a violence that had nothing to do with the actual work in front of her. Dell. She didn't stop working. "Get out." "Let me explain." "Explain?" She turned on him then, and the look on her face was the look of a woman who had spent her whole adult life being treated as a puzzle or a joke or a prize to be won, and had finally found someone who felt different, and had just discovered it was the same story, wearing a kinder face. "Explain how you took $300 to make me fall in love with you?" "I don't need it explained, Wes. I understood it plain the first time Tillman said it." "I took the money before I met you," Wes said, his voice raw. "I took it broke and desperate and half out of my mind with debt, and the moment I actually knew you, I hated myself for it. I tried to give it back today, Dell. I rode into town to end it, and Tillman told me that was never really the point, that he'd engineered the whole thing to distract you from the foreclosure he's been planning for 2 years. Dell's jaw was tight, her eyes bright, with something that might have been tears if she'd allowed herself that. "That's a fine story. It's the true one." "You don't understand," she said, and her voice cracked on it despite everything she was clearly doing to hold it steady. "My whole life, Wes, every man who's ever come near me has come near me as a challenge. A wager. A puzzle to solve, a wild thing to tame, and I have spent 8 years telling myself I didn't care, that I didn't need any of them to see me plain. And then you rode in, and for 5 weeks I let myself believe you were different. I let myself believe it, Wes. That's the part that hurts. Not the bet, that I was fool enough to think this time was real." "It is real," Wes said, and he meant it with everything he had left. "The bet was never why I stayed, Dell. It's not why I rode out in that storm, and it's not why I told you about Tom, and it's not why I've spent every night for 2 weeks lying awake trying to work out how to give the money back, without you ever having to know how ugly the beginning was. I was a coward about the telling. I own that. But don't mistake my cowardice for the lie Tillman's trying to sell you. I never once had to make myself care about you. That happened on its own, and it terrified me, because I knew exactly how it would look once you found out how it started." Dell looked at him for a long moment, her face unreadable, and then she said, very quietly, I need you to leave, Wes. Not because I don't believe a word of what you just said. Because I don't know yet whether I do, and I can't work that out with you standing in front of me looking at me like that." Wes nodded once and did not argue, because he understood, even through the ache of it, that arguing was exactly the wrong thing to do to a woman who had spent her whole life having her wants overridden by men who thought they knew better. He left the barn. He did not go far. He did not chase her. He did not send pleading letters or ride back the next morning full of speeches. What he did instead, over the following 4 days, was ride to every ranch in the county that held a note with Tillman's bank, and he asked each of them, plainly, whether Tillman had ever pressured them toward a personal arrangement, a marriage, a distraction, timed suspiciously close to a foreclosure notice. He found 3 other cases. A widow near Cotton Creek who'd been pushed hard toward a hasty remarriage the same season her land came due. A young rancher's daughter 2 counties over who'd been the subject of a similar wager 4 years back, engineered, it turned out, by the very same bank under a different manager's name before Tillman had taken over the branch. A pattern, Wes realized, gathering the accounts with the same careful, methodical patience he'd have used gentling a spooked horse. Not one incident. A method. He rode to the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne with everything he'd gathered. Sworn statements where he could get them, dates and names where he couldn't, and he laid it in front of a federal land examiner named Corwin, who listened with the particular stillness of a man who had heard enough stories like this to recognize the shape of a genuine one. "This is substantial," Corwin said, reviewing the accounts. "Assuming it holds." "It'll hold," Wes said. "Every word of it's true, and I didn't gather a line of it to save myself. I gathered it because a good woman's about to lose her home to a man using her own reputation as a weapon against her, and she deserves to know exactly what she's actually facing before she decides anything else about me." Corwin looked at him a long moment. "You understand this'll take weeks to formally investigate. I understand the foreclosure notice on Marsh Ranch won't wait weeks," Wes said. "Is there anything that moves faster?" Corwin considered, then reached for paper. "I can send an immediate notice to the bank informing them the loan and its collateral are under federal review pending a fraud inquiry. That alone should stay any foreclosure action until the matter's properly examined. It won't resolve the underlying case, but it buys the ranch time it wouldn't otherwise have." "That's exactly what I need," Wes said. "Send it today." He rode back into Larkspur Hollow 4 days after Dell had told him to leave, dust-worn and hollow-eyed from hard travel, and he went straight to the bank rather than the ranch. Because he understood that the apology owed to Dell meant nothing yet, without the truth laid fully bare first. Tillman was not smiling when Wes walked into his office this time. "Federal notice arrived this morning," Tillman said, his careful composure fraying visibly at the edges. "Fraud inquiry. Very serious language for a very small county bank, Mr. Cade. You should have left her alone," Wes said. "You should have left all of them alone." Cotton Creek. The Hendricks girl 2 counties over. "I've got statements. Tillman, I've got dates that line up too neatly to be coincidence, and a federal examiner in Cheyenne who's already decided your bank's practices are worth a proper look." Tillman's face had gone the particular gray of a man watching a long, careful scheme collapse all at once. "You had no right, I had every right," Wes said. "I took your money once, and it's the worst thing I've ever done, and I mean to spend considerably more than $300 worth of effort making it right." He set a small stack of bills on the desk, the original advance, counted out exactly. "That's yours back. Whatever comes of the inquiry now is between you and the federal government. I'm finished being any part of your schemes." He left Tillman sitting behind his fine desk with the money and the collapsing weight of his own choices, and he rode out to Marsh Ranch, not knowing whether Dell would even agree to see him. She was on the porch when he arrived, sitting beside her father in the thin afternoon sun, and she watched him dismount and crossed the yard with an expression that gave him nothing to read. Careful and guarded in the way he now understood came from 8 years of exactly this kind of approach, ending badly. "I'm not here to ask you to forgive me," Wes said, stopping a respectful distance from the porch steps. "I know that's not mine to ask for on a schedule that suits me. I'm here because I promised myself I'd tell you the whole truth before I asked for anything else, and I haven't finished doing that yet." He told her everything. The federal notice. Cotton Creek. The Hendricks girl. The pattern he'd found, methodical and ugly, of a bank using desperate men and false courtships to distract vulnerable families from the foreclosures already being engineered against them. He told her he'd given the original money back. He told her he hadn't done any of it, hoping it would fix what he'd broken between them, only that he couldn't in good conscience let Tillman keep doing to other families what he'd nearly succeeded in doing to hers. Angus Marsh, silent through most of it, finally spoke. "That true? All of it?" "Every word, sir. You can write to the examiner in Cheyenne yourself. Name's Corwin. He'll confirm it." Angus looked at his daughter for a long moment, something considering in his tired eyes. "Man doesn't do all that just to win a bet, Del." "I know that, Papa," Del said quietly, and Wes felt something in his chest loosen slightly at the sound of it, though he didn't yet let himself hope too far ahead of what she'd actually said. She rose from her chair and came down the porch steps and stood in front of him in the thin autumn light, studying his face the way she'd once studied a spooked horse, looking for the truth of him rather than the performance of it. "I believed you the moment Tillman told me," she said slowly. "That's the part I couldn't say before. I believed the bet was real, because I've spent so long believing every man who came near me had some angle, some wager, some reason that wasn't just me. It was easier to believe you were the same than to believe I'd finally been wrong about that, because being wrong about that meant admitting how much it would hurt to lose you." She looked down, then back up, steadier. "I'm not asking you to have never taken that money, Wes. I'm asking whether everything after it was real." "All of it," Wes said. The storm. Tom's story. Every quiet morning at that fence rail. None of that was ever the bet talking. That was just me, finally standing in front of somebody who saw exactly who I was and didn't flinch from it. "I've never once had to pretend anything with you, Del. That's the whole reason the money became unbearable to keep." Del closed the distance between them, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all, the autumn wind moving through the yard, her father watching quietly from the porch with something like relief settling into his tired face. "I was never trying to tame you," Wes said finally, quiet and certain. "I don't think I could if I tried, and I wouldn't want to. Every fool in this county's been trying to make you smaller and calling it courtship for 8 years, and I watched every one of them fail, and thought good. She shouldn't have to be smaller for anybody. I just wanted to stand beside the whole of you, exactly as you are. That's all this ever was. Once I stopped lying to myself about the beginning of it." Del felt something in her chest that had been braced and guarded for 8 straight years finally, carefully, begin to loosen. "That's a fine thing to say, Weston Cade. It's an honest thing to say," he said. "There's a difference, and I mean to spend as long as you'll let me proving I know it." She almost smiled at that, the ghost of it pulling at the corner of her mouth. "There's still the matter of Tillman. The inquiry. However long that takes to settle proper." "Then we settle it together," Wes said. "However long it takes. No bets. No angles. Just you and me, and whatever's true." Del reached out and took his hand, right there in the yard, in front of her father, in front of God, and the whole wide Wyoming sky, unbothered now by whoever might carry the story back into town by supper. Together, then, she said. The federal inquiry took the better part of 3 months to fully resolve, and when it did, Horace Tillman lost his banking license across 2 territories, was ordered to pay restitution to 4 separate families, including the widow at Cotton Creek and the Hendricks girl, whose name turned out to be Charlotte, and who wrote Dell a letter of quiet, grateful thanks once the case became public record. Marsh Ranch's loan was restructured under new management with terms considerably fairer than anything Tillman had ever offered, and Angus Marsh, freed at last from the particular stress of watching a predator circle his family, found his health improving steadily through that following spring. Wes stayed on as more than a hired hand long before anyone made it official. He proposed to Del Marsh on the same fence rail where they'd first sat together, watching the sun come up over land that was by then entirely and legally hers to keep, and he did it with no ring worth mentioning and no fine speech prepared. Only the plain truth of a man who had learned the hard way what it cost to hide even a small part of himself from someone who deserved the whole. "I've got nothing to offer you that Tillman's $300 could have bought," he said. "No fine ring, no fortune, just a debt I'm still paying down and a string of horses and every honest thing I am, but I'm asking anyway, because I never once wanted to tame you, Delilah Marsh, and I never will. I just want to spend the rest of my life standing beside exactly who you are." "Good," Dell said, laughing and crying at once, in a way she hadn't let herself do in longer than she could remember. "Because I was never going to let anybody tame me anyway. Yes, Wes, 1,000 times. Yes, the whole town of Larkspur Hollow, who had spent 8 years treating Delilah Marsh as a puzzle, a joke, and finally a wager, came out for the wedding that following autumn, and if there was some quiet irony in Percival Andrews standing near the back with his hat in his hands, applauding along with everyone else, nobody was unkind enough to mention it aloud. Del Marsh, who had been sold as gossip and wagered as sport for the better part of her adult life, stood in the golden light of an October afternoon beside a man who had never once tried to make her smaller, and understood at last that she had never been the wild thing needing taming at all. She had only ever been waiting for somebody brave enough to stand beside her exactly as she was.